For our next class, we are going to study painting white flowers. This off-white rose as my demonstration specimen. I have already drawn up the entire flower with some leaves and some stem to make this a more interesting composition. I have done my color breakdown for this white rose. Mostly what I'm showing are shadow colors that I will be using. This warm shadow, which is made up of cadmium yellow pale and scarlet lake. The cool shadow is basically made up of Windsor violet, French ultramarine blue, and a little bit of this warm shadow mix also integrated into this shadow color. I've also considered adding secondary shadows in permanent rose and scarlet lake. You can see all of these colors are quite pale. My leaf color is going to be sap green plus French ultramarine blue, which changes to French ultramarine where I have shiny highlights on the leaf. The bracts are sap green and cadmium yellow pale. Now there might be some mixes and overlaps of some of these things with one another, but these are my foundation colors from which to start this painting. So my drawing has been transferred, and I am now ready to start painting. It's much easier to define the white flower by painting the shadow areas. But since it's a white, we need to be careful that our shadows don't become too dark. So you want to look at not only the shadows, but the underlying reflective colors that you might see underneath those shadows. So that is why I have shown you some pink and some yellows as part of the flower structure. There are also some greens, which would be very diluted shades of the bracts. The way I'm going to start is I'm going to try and look at these underlying colors that I have and put those in very pale washes before I start to put the shadow colors in. So let's get started. I've mixed up a tray of very light washes here. I'm going to put in some of these underlying tones that I see before I drop the shadows in. These are going to be extremely light, and you must always test before you put a color down. Better it should be too light than too dark. In this case, you want to make sure that you're always blending edges so that we don't have any patchiness going on in the process of applying this color. Interestingly enough, white flowers, because they pick up reflections that are around them, actually have quite a bit of color in them. If you have larger areas that need painting, you can wet the paper. In some cases, I have not felt the need to do so. That is why I am working dry. Basically, these are very small areas, and they're easy to blend. And because you're putting such light washes down, it's really not necessary to wet the page if you don't want to. Just make sure that you blend those edges with clean water. Now you may find that there are sections where after you've put your shadows in that you may want to add more color, in which case you can always do that. Remember that botanical gray, once it goes down, is permanent and will not lift. So you'll have the opportunity to lay more color over the top of something without it lifting. So you should be able to see some color here, and it's very light. And when we get to the shadows, we're going to choose and paint the darkest shadows first, which will help to define the structure. But before I do that, I'm going to start painting in some values in the leaves and bracts so that we are working the entire painting. Now that I have the leaves blocked in and I have some of the colors that I want in the flower, it's time to add some shadows. The first shadows I'm going to put in are the ones that I see as the darkest. And that'll help me to gauge where and how much value I put into the lighter shadows. And this may still require more balancing than the first wash will indicate. Again, I am still going to keep my edges very soft, looking at the overall shape of the shadow and going in very quickly to make sure that I don't have a hard edge. I'm cleaning my brush in order to spread that color out. Anywhere it looks like I have too much puddle, I pick it up. Even though it might seem to be too light, I can always go back in later and darken up an area. Since I'm using ultramarine with Winsor Violet, I have to always stir up the mix before I paint so that my ultramarine has not settled. I've added quite a bit of shadow to this rose, but in order for me to really determine how much, I'm going to have to now start painting in some of the greens so that I have a contrast to the white flower. So I'm continuing to add color, especially in the shadow areas, in order to get this form defined. It doesn't get blotchy looking. At this point, I'm going to start to use some disappearing line to define some edges so that I don't get too many darks, and so that we can see the actual structure of the rose and still maintain its whiteness. So I'm working with a very small brush. The one I'm using right now is a 0, but your 2 will work just as well. And remember to let your line fade out so that it doesn't become an outline in the process of defining these edges. When doing this, you want to make sure that you're really capturing the contour. Don't generalize about what it is that you see. Really look at the true contour. So as you can see, the more contrast I create, the whiter the flower looks. And that is the way you go about getting this white specimen to look white, even though it's on a white background. Just build your values slowly and it will all come together.